Thank you, everybody, for joining us. My name is Dr. Taylor Clem. I'm with IFAS Extension Nassau County, and I am joined today with some of our Master Gardener volunteers. We have Carl Schaefer and Shirley Lohman. And as part of our presentation today, we're going to talk all about your wild Florida-friendly landscape. So it's really thinking about our landscapes and how they can be beneficial to attract wildlife. In some situations, we can learn about how some of these tips and tricks can be used to help dissuade some problematic wildlife. But we're going to be really focusing on how to attract those really beneficial things to our landscape. But before we get going, there's a couple things I want to share. This is a webinar. We are recording it. Everybody that's registered, I'll send you a link of the recording as well as a copy of the PowerPoint presentation so you can have it as your reference, as well as some other cool documents that come from the University of Florida that go into more detail about attracting wildlife to your landscape. But feel free throughout the presentation, as part of security purposes of this webinar, you don't have the ability to share your camera or use your microphone, but feel free to, through the chat box or to the Q&A, you can send messages to Carl, Shirley, and I, and we can answer those as we go along. And also at the end, we'll make sure we have some time dedicated to help answer any of the questions that you all have. We can talk about specific animals or specific plants maybe for those animals. So we're going to kind of do an overview of why we want to attract wildlife and those tips and tricks to do so we can have a wild, in a good way, Florida-friendly landscape. So anyways, so let's go ahead and get going because we want to learn about something fun. So I always have the essential questions at the beginning of my programs. So our two questions that we'll be able to answer after the end of the program today is, what is a Florida-friendly landscaping program? Because I still like to tie everything back to that. And then also, what are the essential elements to attracting wildlife to my landscape? So why is this so important? We think about wildlife and habitat throughout the state, and there's a lot of times we get calls, and I know that Carl and Shirley have had many interactions like this. Homeowners will call out to us and say, you know, I have a snake in my yard. What kind of snake is this? Or I want to attract butterflies, or there's these birds I want to bring into my landscape. What do I do? You know, and there's a lot of times we think about wildlife conflict as well. So those are the bad things. So if you actually look at Carl's image in his back behind him, y'all probably recognize what that is. So that is, was that just an eastern diamondback? Rattlesnake that was actually in Shirley's yard. But we have interactions sometimes with wildlife that can be wonderful, but also scary. But we learned about wildlife and why are wildlife moving around? Why is it important that we start to think, why do we want to attract wildlife to our yards? So I like to show this image with anything that we're doing with horticulture. You've probably seen me do this before or show this before, but this is Florida in 2005. The red is all the developed areas. So schools, homes, commercial areas, institutional, industrial, etc. Those are all the areas that are red. And then the areas that are that darker green, those are conservation or permanently protected lands. And that beige color is just everything else. But we do know through a study that Florida's population is expected to double by 2060 from this specific plan. It's been updated in 2070, but looking at the 2060 plan, we know that Florida is going to grow and develop based off of certain standards. So seeing how development's happening, we can kind of anticipate what that growth and development is going to look like. So all of a sudden, when we think about that population and how it's going to double by 2060, this is what the anticipated land use and developed area in the state of Florida is going to look like. Nassau County isn't growing nearly, it's one of the fastest growing counties in the state, but it also has a lower density than some of the others, but it's definitely still growing pretty significantly. And we see it every single day as we're driving around the community and seeing construction happening. So one of the drawbacks that we have to that is the use of water resources. With that expected population, it's an increased demand for water. That can lead to an increased amount of pollution. And then as well as that decreases habitat. So that can decrease those habitats for filter polluted water to, sorry, so those habitats to filter polluted water for enters the aquifer, but also those decreased habitats eliminate those natural ecosystems and those natural wildlife areas that provide essential habitat for animals to thrive. And another reason that's also important to think about is because water is such a crucial and critical element to the success of the landscape, our wildlife, our habitats, our ecosystems. Florida's entire economy and environmental success is all based around healthy water resources. But when we look at the development, we do know that approximately 60% of homeowner water use is attributed to lawn irrigation, lawn and landscape irrigation, which is pretty significant. And in some of those areas, we're not maintaining our landscapes well. It can lead to non-point source pollution, so like nitrogen and phosphorus, which are fertilizers. If we do not, or those are nutrients within fertilizers. If we don't apply those appropriately or correctly, we contribute to that pollution, which destroys and disrupts a lot of our natural ecosystems and habitats. So it's really important for us to think about our role in Florida for its success is based off of how we're using water, how we're thinking about wildlife, and how we're managing just our landscapes, whether it just be our home, or if we're thinking about our entire community, we each and everybody has an important role to play. So that's why the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program, kind of exists, is to set up these different principles that we can follow to help make sure that we have an attractive, colorful, and a diverse yard. It's friendly to wildlife. It's environmentally responsible. And then bonus is that can be significantly less work than a traditional Florida landscape. But really its goals come back to conserving water, and protecting water quality. And part of that is providing significant habitat for wildlife. So with the program, there are 9 principles. It all starts with right plant, right place. So when we talk about attracting wildlife to our landscapes, what's that right plant for that right place? What grows, which thrives, what helps provide these certain habitats for wildlife to be able to use our property as a way that they pass through, or maybe a place that they live. But there's these 9 principles. So right plant, right place, you start with that, you can be very successful with the rest of the principles. The second is water efficiently, then there's fertilize appropriately, mulch. The 5th principle is attract wildlife, manage yard pests, recycle, reduce stormwater runoff, and protect the waterfront. So of course, as part of the FFL program and putting emphasis on attracting wildlife, we're really going to look at these 2 principles. We'll look at the right plant, right place because it's very important. And then we'll really do a deep dive into that attract wildlife portion of the FFL program. Who knows what this plant is? Put it in the chat box if you know. Would this be a plant that you'd want to see in your landscape? That's a trick question. You don't want it. This plant is called coral Artesia. So it's a highly invasive plant, and it spreads all over the state because of its berries, the amount of seeds and fruits that it produces. So when we talk about right plant, right place, there's a few things that we talk about, and one of them is making sure that we're not choosing invasive species. And you cannot buy coral Artesia in a store. It's illegal to trade. It's illegal to buy. It's illegal to sell because of how invasive it is. But there are a lot of other invasive species that you can just go down to your local garden center and you can buy them right off the counter, right off the shelves, like Boston fern or the tuberous sword ferns and Mexican petunia. Those are common ones that you can just go and buy at pretty much any store, and they're highly invasive. But when we think about right plant, right place, plants are happy and thrive in the in certain environmental conditions. Some plants love full sun, others love full shade. So if you have a landscape that's full shade, you want to make sure you put plants in that like that deep shade, or they like the amount of water that's in there. So what are some of those other things that we might need to think about if we're selecting plants? What would we think about like environmental conditions that can influence or help determine what kind of plants we should put in our landscape? Take a minute or so and put that in the chat box, some of the things that you might think of. No, I haven't seen any responses yet, but Shirley and Carl, I'll call you out on this one. What are some of those other things that we like to think about when making, oh, Sam just came popping in. So yeah, we have water. Yeah, so we have some weird seasons. Some plants, what are some ones that can withstand like our very wet seasons? We're gonna have times of the year where like the summer, it's just, I feel like it's clockwork. Every day around 3 o'clock, it's going to rain. But then all of a sudden we're in our dry season right now, and plants might not see nearly as much water. So there are some plants that are very drought tolerant that we can put into our landscapes that do well during those wet times of the year. It's wonderful. What are some other ones? And Carl and Shirley, feel free to chime in if you have any.
Fertilizer needs.
Yeah, fertilizer, nutrient needs. So some plants need a lot of nutrients, and if you do it well, then they're going to be very efficient in how they uptake those. If you don't do it correctly, the plant could die, or you could end up polluting our water resources. Or you can put plants in that do really well in those sterile conditions that don't need any additional inputs. Soil pH is wonderful. Yeah. So soil pH, we have some plants that I love acidic soils like blueberries. If you're ever putting blueberries in, you need a soil pH of like 4.5. But if you have a pH of around 8, blueberries will not do well at all. A lot of plants won't do too terribly well at 8. But knowing your soil pH can really help determine which plants can grow. So you don't have to do any type of soil amendments, because if you don't have to do soil amendments, cool, that's one less thing you have to do. So they're non-native, but ligustrums are always a good plant for if you have a very alkaline soil, so very high pH. Salt and wind tolerance. Yeah, that's something that, especially if you live out on Amelia Island, you definitely have to think about that salt tolerance. There's a lot of communities that I do know that whether it's salt spray or even the surface water, the surface water could be brackish, and that salt could damage the roots of the plants. So really think about that tolerance and what are those concerns that you need. And it's not just Amelia Island, it's in Yulee as well, if you're living off of 200 in those areas before you get to the river. But other ones are like USDA hardiness zone. Some plants don't like our cold temperatures, or we might get too hot for some other plants. So we call that the USDA hardiness zone. So we're really thinking about ultimately, if we're planting a plant in our yard, what are those things that are going to impact it? That you all mentioned that the water, the amount of sunlight, those environmental conditions, those climate conditions like the weather, the temperatures, salt and wind tolerance. These are things we just need to make sure that we're considering, because if we can match the plants to our site, those plants will establish well, they'll be happy and healthy, they'll thrive and be very successful, and they'll minimize any type of inputs that you would have to use in that landscape. Because if we don't put a plant in that's the right plant for the right place, those plants will be unhappy, they'll be unhealthy, and they'll start to stress. And next thing you know, they'll have disease and insects and pests and all of that. So right plant, right place, because when we're thinking about attracting wildlife to our landscapes, we need to make sure that we're following this principle to make sure that we have a successful landscape to attract those wildlife. So the fifth principle is that attract wildlife. And I put on social media yesterday about the image about the passion flower. Did any of you see that about the passion flower? You can put that in the chat box. Why is a passion flower beneficial for our landscapes, for attracting wildlife? Does anybody know? It's a beautiful flower, one of my favorites. Yeah, so it's a pollinator plant, definitely. So it's a pollinator plant, but also when we think about butterflies, some butterflies need specific plants that we call host plants. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So they're host plants. And the host plants is like those plants. It's like a butterfly will only be able to really reproduce, lay its eggs, and have successful larvae or caterpillars if that host plant is available. So like monarch butterflies, they need milkweed. That's their host plant. Well, Florida's butterfly, our state butterfly, is called the zebra longwing, and its host plant is the passion flower. And it is a vine, and it is, oh, it's beautiful. It's such a cool plant. But anyways, so when we start thinking about attracting wildlife, you know, go back to that image I showed earlier about the state where we're growing, we're spreading. And what's happening as that, what we're seeing happen as we grow is we're seeing those areas, or what we call as wildlife or habitat fragmentation. And essentially what that is we have these wonderful habitats, and I think, whoops, we have habitat fragmentation. I had a slide about it. So essentially, we have our habitats, and say we rip down some of the habitats for certain types of development, clear cut, thinning, etc. Doesn't necessarily matter, but we break apart those habitats. The most important part of those habitats, like you see in those contiguous or those large areas of habitats, are the interior spaces. So you need that large interior space because that's where you see a lot of diversity in the species and wildlife that live there, as well as you see a diversity in the genetic pool. So the DNA of the wildlife. But what happens is that edge area or that edge habitat, that's kind of the area where the diversity isn't as great, but also that's the area that we start to see a lot of conflict. The human conflict with wildlife, like a bear walking through your backyard. I know that's rare, but I've heard that this happened on Amelia Island before. But or you might get deer in your backyard that's chewing on your vegetables. But whatever that conflict could be, it could, you know, situations of roadkill. It could be a deer that gets hit, a raccoon that gets hit, a possum that gets hit. So we fragment these landscapes, and it decreases the diversity because that contiguous, that large habitat area starts to fragment. It's much smaller. So you don't really have those large areas for larger apex animals to be able to be healthy or successful. Carl may be able to give me a little bit better understanding on this. I'm not 100% sure, but like the Florida Panther, we think about the Florida Panther, right? And one of the hardest things that we are dealing with across the state is it's an endangered species, but fragmentation has really had a big impact on the genetic pool of the panther. So we can have males and females mate, but they might not be successful with the young. And that's just because it's the effects of almost like inbreeding to a certain extent with the panther. The panther population in Florida actually used to stretch historically all the way up into like Alabama, Mississippi area. That's where it was like a contiguous population. But fragmentation completely separated those. And if I remember, it was like maybe 5-10 years ago, I heard that they were actually capturing some of the panthers in Florida, relocating them to a population up north, and vice versa to help improve the diversity. Because even though there's not that conflict that's happening, what's happening is that genetic material is decreasing. So it's causing the population to slowly just decline because it's not just being as successful in reproduction. Now, of course, we don't want to attract Florida panthers per se to our yard, especially if we live like on a quarter-acre lot. But I have a friend down in South Florida has a big farm, and he captures Florida panthers and black bears and all, and it's wonderful. He has game cameras set out, and he'll post pictures when he finds them. To him, that's wonderful. And if I had his property, yeah, that'd be wonderful too. But thinking about not just the panther, but every single other species that can exist and live within our part of the state suffers from this fragmentation and has similar issues where it conflicts with there's conflicts that occur with vehicles, human interactions, and I'll say bad human interactions, because there's wonderful ways that we can have beneficial, great interactions with wildlife. But so this fragmentation is being caused by development, but also natural disasters. But with a lot of natural disaster areas, those areas do have the ability to recover over time, whereas once developed, we can kind of lose that benefit. So habitat fragmentation is happening, and as we develop and more and grow as a state, more fragmentation is going to occur. So this kind of just hits those bullets that I've already talked about. Loss of interior habitat is vital. Increase of edge habitat is that conflict area. And the habitat quality decreases, reproduction successes decrease, and the genetic diversity decreases. So, thinking about how much we're going to grow, we know there's going to be fragmentation. So we start to think, okay, how can I play an important role in helping attract wildlife? Because why is it important? And I'll kind of show you, this is going to like a simple visual demonstration, but here's our unimpacted habitat prior to development. And then what happens is that development starts to fragment that landscape. So we have these fragmented landscapes, and this can be from roadways, it can be from commercial areas, residential areas, major storms or fires come through, can cause some damage, but we have that fragmented landscape. But imagine, if you will, if we decided, okay, so we have these fragmented landscapes, how can my home become an area where we can help attract wildlife? So next thing you know it, your home is becoming a space within that fragmented area. And it's going to be for small things. It could be like birds and pollinators, but those are equally as important. Those are very, very important. Those animals that are at the very bottom of the quote unquote food chain are vital for the success of everything upstream in those apex predators. So, having butterflies, they're going to come in, the larvae is going to munch at the plants that you got, but they're also great food source for birds. And so you're creating an ecosystem. So your home has the ability to become a space where you can provide this basic habitat to attract wildlife. But say all of a sudden your neighborhood, you start working with the different homes in your community, and all of a sudden you have this very vibrant area where you're kind of creating this much larger artificial habitat where you're trying to create and be as friendly for attracting wildlife in your landscape decisions. And then add on to that and say, okay, we have these other areas. What do we have, like greenways? There's some really cool research that we've done, whether it be kind of like bicycle trails, conservation easements. But one of the researchers with the University of Florida, his name is Jarrett Daniels, and he has this really cool study they calls Pollinator Highway, where it's all the research on why we're putting thousands upon thousands of wildflowers out along our highways and roads. And that's because we find that actually, even though there's mortality rates between vehicles and those insects, we actually have find through that research that the population and genetic diversity is significantly increased because the amount of space that those pollinators have the ability to move around. And also those farmers that are adjacent to those roads really benefit because their plants are getting really pollinated, which is wonderful. So we can connect then. So we have these little spaces, these dots, these homes, these neighborhoods, and we can connect them with these different greenways. But then say there's part of communities that you're able to get extra land or buy land or part of land that's slated for development that you can put into conservation easements. You can help grow those wildlife areas even more. So this goes a little bit beyond what we can do in our yard, but this really thinks about what can we do at a city or a county level, or even just a community level, thinking about how we planning the community. But it's important that you know, as part of that planning process, we're all citizens, so we have the ability to communicate that with our local leaders. So conservationism. So next thing you know it, we did have this once in unimpacted habitat that got fragmented. But by just making small changes as a community, as neighborhoods, we have the ability to help rebuild as much as possible to help minimize the impacts of that development. So let's talk about what do we need to attract wildlife. So I asked this guy, he's a friend of mine. He's not really a friend of mine. Do y'all know who this is? This is Bear Grylls. So he's like a survivalist expert. He had a show on Discovery Channel for a while. And so he's a wildlife survivalist expert. And if you were to ask him, hey, Bear, what's the most important things that you need if you were trying to survive in the wild? Like if you got stuck out in the middle of the wilderness, what do you need to survive? What are some of those things? Put in the chat box what you think would be most important. This takes me back to all my wilderness survival days when I was in Boy Scouts growing up too. Chat box, what do you think you need? Yeah. Food and living area. Yeah, you need food, water, shelter. So if you're actually prioritizing them, you would say shelter, fire, water, food, if I'm remembering correctly. Yeah. Shelter, fire, water, food. So if you were in a wilderness survival situation, those are the priorities. You need to find shelter first, because if you don't find shelter, what's going to happen is you can succumb to like heat stroke or hypothermia, depending on where you're at, really quickly. Fire, again, to help with if the weather's too cold, etc. Water, and then food would be the last. So anyways, so those are the things that we need to attract wildlife. It's the same as just like if we were just going to ask a survival expert, what do we need to survive? These are the same things that we need in our yard or our landscapes to attract wildlife. So if we wanted to look at kind of like more scientific purpose, so what we're having here is these hierarchy of needs. And at the very top is this, we do this in like education. There's the self-actualization. So that's achieving your full potential. But the only way that you can get there is by achieving the most basic needs. And you can look at the bottom, that's psychological needs and safety needs. So food, water, warmth, rest, security, safety. So same thing for wildlife. If we want them to be successful, we need to meet the bare minimum of needs in order to be successful. So when we start to think about our landscapes and attracting wildlife, we're looking at achieving and having those most basic needs. So it's always important to think is, what do I want to attract when you're thinking about wildlife, and what do I not want to attract? And understanding those basic needs can be beneficial for you. So I love that image of the egret on the alligator. That's a very Florida photo, I think. But when we think about attracting wildlife, we want to think about what do we want to attract. If you wanted to honestly just kind of create the perfect oasis for wildlife, design for the birds. If you design for the birds, you're going to attract almost everything into your landscape, into your yard, to your garden. And it's wonderful. So we actually have some biologists with the University of Florida that say, you know, when you're thinking about your landscapes and attracting wildlife, design for birds. You design for birds, you have a wonderful landscape that's very beneficial to wildlife, because you're going to attract pretty much everything. But, you know, when we think about, a good example is, what do you not want to attract? Raccoons or possums or deer can sometimes be problematic in your gardens. So we try to create barriers to those basics: food, water, shelter, Usually food is the main instigator in these situations. But trying to create barriers to them getting food. One strategy I do like to do for, like, if you have a vegetable garden and you're having a deer problem or a rabbit problem, um, do what we do in agriculture is we create trap crops. So you can plant, if you have a space somewhere else in your yard where it's just the plants you don't care about, just go put them out there. So that's where the animals will go and munch on those plants, and provide barriers like fences or scarecrows or whatever it might be to dissuade them from going there, and they can help move them elsewhere on your landscape. But when we're thinking, but going back, like, what do we need to do, or what do we think about when attracting wildlife? So we're going to talk through some of these like key little bullets. And a lot of this is actually going to come from the publication when I was talking about designing and planning for the birds, because it's very important, because it's a good blanket. If we design for the birds, you're going to attract everything. So we're going to cover each one of these little tips as part of how do we plan our landscapes to attract wildlife. So the tips: provide food, supply water, leave snags, which is really, really cool if you don't know what that is, manage pets, that's really important, reduce insecticide use, reduce mowed lawn areas, and increase vertical layering. So the first thing is providing food. How do we provide food in the landscape? So it could be bird feeders. That's the most easy, basic one. Like there's an oriole that's enjoying himself a orange. You can get food blocks, suet, seed mixtures, you name it. I like using some of these unique ones because they're not going to really attract as much squirrels. But if you just get a seed mix, you could have squirrel haven in your backyard. So there are bird feeders that you can get that I like. The bird feeders that if there's too much weight, it closes down and shuts the food source. That's really good for like the smaller birds, like your tufted titmice, I just can't think of all of a sudden and seeing birds in my head. What's another good bird? The small bird. That'll come in, Carl.
We get a lot of chickadees.
Chickadees.
They get real ownership with these feeders. The titmice, the cardinals, they're the primary ones I've seen.
Wrens, yeah.
White-eyed vireos.
Yeah. So there's so many ways that we can provide food, and this is a really good, I would say, supplement. But when we're picking plant material, we can also think, what is the food that we can provide just through plant selection? So I like to think seasonally. Birds need food year round, not just one time of the year. So you can always think about what are those foods that we can provide in our landscape throughout different times of the season. And if you have in times, and two plants that I really like is beautyberry. I love beautyberry, such a wonderful plant. And then the mulberry, planting mulberries. Mulberries, once they start fruiting, I swear they fruit for such a long time. But you could almost, between like the time when the beautyberry is present to when the mulberry starts to fruit, those two plants can pretty much provide a lot of food throughout the year, but still supplementing it can always be very beneficial. And I remembered my story. The birds will be very thankful and happy for you. Happy for it when you do so. So one cool example that I have is when I used to work for University of Kentucky's botanical gardens. I would be out there in the middle of the winter, walking through the gardens, helping tend to things. And there's one year I went out there and we had like a foot of snow on the ground, which is kind of abnormal for Lexington, Kentucky. And in the middle of the garden, there's this little like centralized part of the garden that's completely enclosed with hollies. It's like American hollies. And I kind of walked in there, and when I walked in, there was hundreds of robins around in this little centralized area. And I went and I sat on a bench, and they were there and they weren't flying off when I walked into this central area. And they weren't flying off because they were all the size of grapefruits, all they've been doing is just eating the holly berries because it's the middle of the winter. There's not much food available, but these holly trees provided more than enough. So I was actually sitting on the bench, and there's this really fat robin sitting on the other end of the bench, just looking at me, just like, I'm too full to fly off. Please leave me be, And it was like that image that I had is just, they were everywhere. But it was just really cool to experience, because in that situation, we're thinking about seasonally and providing food and habitat. That was a great example that there wasn't too much available, but it meant, I know, the world to the robins, because that food source was available when everything else was covered in snow. They had something they could reliably eat.
There's one other part, Taylor.
Yeah.
We're really important for migratory birds. It's not just our resident birds, those robins. We don't have robins here in the summer, but boy, you will see them coming through in the fall and early winter. And these fruit producing trees, shrubs are critical for them to survive that migration.
Oh, absolutely, because they need to build up a lot of that mass. Like the ruby-throated hummingbirds are another great example of the migratory birds. I mean, they fly straight across the Gulf of Mexico from Mexico and come right into Florida. And those tiny little bodies making that big flight, they're hungry when they get here, and then they nest. So yeah, migratory bird species. I'm gonna see if I can find it. There's a really cool website, I think, through the Audubon, where you can select a bunch of different bird species, and you can kind of scroll and see where those populations are throughout the year. It's really, really neat. So you can know kind of like when to anticipate that they would arrive to your area.
Cornell University also has a big part on birds, and they're an land grant university also, and they're an excellent resource on bird population dynamics, identification, migrations. That's another resource.
Yeah, I'll send everybody a link to that one, because I have the app on my phone, the Cornell Bird app on my phone, that I like a lot. So, but yeah, thinking seasonally, and yes, absolutely, the migratory birds is an important part of that. It's not just our residents, but who's just coming in temporarily to stay. And also thinking about not just fruits, but the flowers. Where are those nectar sources for bees and hummingbirds and butterflies that we can provide throughout the year? Those are all unbelievably important for all of those species.
And the fruits and the fruits and seeds provide primarily carbohydrates. The plants that produce the tiny flies and caterpillars provide the protein and the fat that's critical, especially for nestling young birds in the nest. They've got to have the protein and the fat. And these plants provide that, which feeders typically won't provide.
Absolutely. So diversity of plants in your landscape to provide a diversity of food is important. Wonderful. That's great. Providing water, of course, you need water, whether it be, I know there's always concern about mosquitoes in the yards, but there's easy ways to circumnavigate that with water. I love this picture of the cardinal taking a bath. But like bird baths are very, very simple, easy to maintain. You can put I have a solar bubbler on the one that we have outside and never have a mosquito problem because the water is just churning. And birds come and enjoy that. I also like for butterflies, they can't really use water in depths like that. So you can sometimes get those shallow little pans or logs that you put in your landscape that just hold a little bit of water, because then they'll get up right to the edge. And they'll get water that way. So how are you providing water in your landscape? Some people, it might not be necessary because you have a fresh water source nearby that's adjacent to you. So it's not much of a problem, but still having that within your landscape can be very beneficial. So I really like tree snags. Tree snags are essentially those dead trees that you have in your landscape. Or they can be fallen or still upright. But a tree snag, a dead tree, have the ability to provide cover and nesting for over 40 species of birds and animals. That's a lot. That's a lot. And I really like, if you've ever gone like canoeing or kayaking down like the Swanee River or the Santa Fe River, you can look at all the trees that line the river. Some alive, some are dead, but when you go by them, you just see dozens of holes all in them that are being used by some of the birds, different birds. It could be other insects. Um, so having that snag can be very, very beneficial for your landscape to attract wildlife. Now, I do have to put a caveat that if you live in a place where, say, you have a large pine tree that's dying and dead, and it's as a much higher risk of falling over. If it was going to fall over and land on something like your house or something that causes damage, you should be cautious if you keep it. But if you do have plenty of space for it, these are very valuable. So, and then just the tree snags, if they fall over, you can do like brush piles. And those brush piles become great areas on the ground to provide habitat for smaller animals and mammals, birds that live on that lower canopy area or around the ground. And as well as it provides habitat as the wood starts to break down, decay for insects, other beetles, and then that becomes a valuable food source for everything up from that. So these are very valuable assets to our landscapes, which are commonly left out. And then also manage pets. We all have cats, or we know people that have cats, but it's so important to think about the impact that they have on wildlife. So they can scare off wildlife, but they also can kill wildlife. And each year it is globally estimated that about 1.3 to 4 billion birds and 6.3 to 22.3 billion mammals are killed each year due to pets at our house. Predominantly cats, but dogs, they're a part of it too, but predominantly cats. So like outdoor cats, I mean, we've probably all know a cat that has probably brought us something dead before, but it's important to know that they have a huge, huge impact on wildlife within our communities. So it's very important to think about that. I have 2 cats, and both of them are indoor cats because I do that as a way as to help with the wildlife. And I have one that can't go outside anyways, but the other one, we have him inside. So this is Nemo. He was a stray neighborhood cat that would wander all around. And he stole my hat one day. But he was a cute cat though, very nice cat, but he would try to kill things. So it's important to think about managing our pets within our landscapes. Next is reduce insecticide use. So how do we control pests? Because there's still going to be pests in our landscapes. But a lot of times you'll see a lot of people jump to using this chemical insecticides or as an intervention method when there's ways that we can prevent the pest from becoming a problem in the first place. So if we always think about cultural controls, so how we're managing the landscape, so right plant, right place, you have healthy plants that are healthy and love being in the landscape that they're in. That's a cultural control that they're going to naturally be resistant to pest damage. So if you have a happy, healthy plant in your landscape because it's the right plant, right place, that's going to withstand a lot of that pest damage and pest stress. But if you have a plant that is really unhappy and unhealthy, it's going to be a magnet for all the pests in your landscape, disease, other pests that will help eat and damage the plant material, spread plant viruses, etc. They're going to be attracted to the stressed plants. So if we just manage plants appropriately, those cultural controls, we can reduce our pest damage and pest concerns within our landscape. But then if you do have some pest issues, usually it's pretty minimal. So you can just do physical and mechanical removal. So if you have aphids on your plant, don't go out and spray it with an insecticide. You can literally just pinch off that part of the plant, or you can just smash them all with your finger pretty quickly. And that controls the population. And in some situations, we do have an opportunity to do biological controls. So biological controls, we use Mother Nature for the control of some landscape pests. So if cultural and physical controls won't work, we do have biological opportunities available. And then if none of that works, that's when we think about the chemicals. But if we follow these integrated pest management strategies, it's actually pretty rare that you actually need to get to that intervention where you're doing chemical control applications, where if you're doing proper cultural management, you should be able to have a happy, healthy landscape. You know, like even if with like St. Augustine grass and landscapes, you know, you're going to have chinch bugs. It's always going to happen. But if you manage the turf grass appropriately, then you will have chinch bugs, but the population won't be at a threshold where it's actually causing damage. So a lot of our issues that we do see in our landscapes that cause stress and then lead to pesticide or usage or pest damage is because we overwater our landscapes. So by just irrigating appropriately, will significantly reduce a lot of the damage that we see of pests within the landscapes. So we can always reduce mowed lawns area. So think about right plant, right place. So we know about the environmental conditions, but I also think about what's the functionality of a space. You know, right now I got two boys. One's trying to walk. The other one you can't keep from, he's constantly running and moving around. So having that space in our backyard that has more turf grass, it works. It's a good function for those kids. But as that function changes, is that the most appropriate? Is that the right plant in the right place? Because I can bring in other plants that reduce my work in the landscape and also can provide more structure and more habitat than what I already have. So thinking about that functionality of your landscapes and reducing mowed areas and bringing in more higher diversity of pollinator friendly, wildlife friendly plants can really help improve your backyard as an attractor for wildlife. And then think about layers. Whenever I say this, I always say onions have layers, which is, if you've ever seen the movie Shrek, that's what I'm referencing. But think about layers in your landscapes. Wildlife just doesn't live right around your feet. There's multiple layers. There's that ground layer, there's a shrub layer, there's an understory, and then there's the overstory canopy where different species like to live. We have butterflies that their host plant, I think it's a hair streak, is its host plant is a mistletoe. You'll never see those guys. They're unbelievably important pollinators, but they're flying about 40 feet up over your head, and they're tiny, and they're laying their eggs on mistletoes, and then the larvae are up in the canopies of oak trees or other trees. So you never see those guys, but then you might have all those little insects and pollinators and everything's kind of staying at the ground level and shrub area that you see. So having layering in your landscape really helps significantly improve the diversity of the wildlife that you bring, because you're just increasing the diversity of your habitat as well. So the more diverse your habitat, the more diverse species you can attract, or just the more diverse your landscape that you create, the more resilient and typically stronger of a wildlife attractor that you do have for those species that do come around. So really thinking about increasing layering with different plant heights can really help out. So you know, another example that we could think about with regards to increasing layering is the green anole. So the green anole is our native lizard, little green guys. But when was the last time you all saw a green anole? You know, so do you know what happens to those? You're welcome, Sonia. She said, thank you for helping me feel better about the mistletoe in my oaks. They can still be problematic if there's a lot of them, but they do actually have value, which is good. So, but y'all know what happened to the green anoles, the green little lizards that are native here? What color of lizards do you also? Yeah. So yeah, that's right. So the brown anoles have outcompeted them. So they're actually invasive. That's an invasive little lizard that worked its way in here, and they've outcompeted a lot of those green anoles. And you know what has happened? The brown anoles all stay low on that ground layer. The green anoles are pretty much now living up in the canopies of trees. So they're still here, but they're just They're just staying up high because they can still survive up there. But again, it's still kind of a fragmented landscape because those tiny little guys moving tree to tree can be kind of tough, but it's just because they've been out competed. So layering, that's a benefit because yes, those lizards prefer that ground layer, but as that invasive species came in, the brown anole, and took over and out competed them, that habitat still existed for the native green anole. So I always get a little excited when I see a green anole now, like, yay. Oh, you're muted, Carl.
Thank you. As animals get displaced, it pushes them into different trophic level where different birds are and so forth, can expose them to more natural predation, environmental stressors. So it's possible the green anole lizard will decline, not because it's being predated by brown anoles or outcompeted there, but exposure to other pressures that it wasn't facing before, even disease. So anyway, just throwing
That's
that
valuable.
out.
That's good.
Mhm.
That's very good. So, well, not a good thing, but that's a good, very good point.
Can I throw one other thing in?
Absolutely. Because that was the last one. We're getting to essential questions, so we're wrapping up.
Most people want to attract the passerine or the songbirds, and most of the time they feed on seeds and berries and some insects. But if you attract the passerine birds, the songbirds, you're going to attract red-shouldered hawks and Cooper's hawks, owls, and they're going to be feeding on those songbirds. And it's part of the dynamic. So if you want to attract birds, you're probably not going to just attract the ones you wanted. You're going to attract something, and you may see active predation in your backyard. I've seen it where they've whacked cardinals right in my backyard, and having supplemental feeders really kind of exposes these birds to a lot more pressure. If you spread them out with natural shrubbery and so forth, and they're feeding, they're not quite as likely to get hit as badly as if they're centered on a seed feeder.
Yeah, because like if you have, say, I have a seed feeder in the middle of my yard, that's like the only place that those birds come to. They're very vulnerable compared to if I have multiple food sources around different parts of the landscape that allows them to kind of distribute a little bit more. And then I can give them a little extra protection around those areas as well, right? Is that correct?
And you'll also see interspecies fighting increases too. There's a lot more fighting for the primary position at that feeder versus spread out across a garden area or a natural area. Anyway, just
cowbirds could be pretty problematic. Yeah, they can be too aggressive.
Taylor, another point Carl made earlier about the caterpillars and the small insects being the protein that the birds need. Most of the plants that the caterpillars and small pollinators feed on are native. There are a lot of non-native plants that provide nectar, but most of the ones for the caterpillars and the small bees need to be native because that's what those insects choose to eat.
Yeah, it's what they've evolved with. So having plants that are those native species, you have a much higher diversity in the species that can use that plant material. There's some really cool research that's been done where they try to quantify the amount of species in native or non-native situations. Oh, you muted yourself again, Carl.
Shirley's got me trained to just, sit down and be quiet. No, I'm just teasing. She doesn't. People don't realize it, but hummingbirds get so much more from native plants than they do from or sugar water combination. They'll actually pick up pollen when they're getting the nectar out of a plant, but they're also whacking insects, tiny insects that live in these plants, and that's critical for their young. And a hummingbird is a single parent. It's the female that's feeding. She's got to work real hard to raise the two young she's got. if you have shrubbery there, plants there, that she can get a full, banquet, rather than just going to the feeder getting nectar. She can get everything that her chicks need out in the shrubs.
We had a ruby-throated hummingbird recently going after white flies that were on some of the plants that we had outside at my parents' house. So you go out there, you shake the plant a little bit, you see white flies, and I was like, oh no, here comes the viruses. And then, but no, those ruby-throated hummingbird, they loved it. Like they'd zip all around and you'd see them like, just fly past one and it'd be gone.
I've seen the same thing in my backyard. If you watch and sit and watch, you'll see the little females just whacking all these little white flies coming off. It's really impressive.
Biological control. I mean, that's a great example of biological control, because white flies are pests for landscapes that many people spray with insecticides. But if you have a habitat where you're creating this ecosystem, you have those natural controls that you can kind of have planned into it.
One more point about snags or branches and so forth. I've watched hummingbirds come in, tank up with nectar or catch flies, and they fly directly up about 5 feet to dead twigs and sit. And I'm convinced it's because their gullets are full and they've got to just sit there for a few minutes and rest. And then they fly off. They almost always do that. It's pretty.
I saw that, Carl, when we were at your house. We watched that one hummingbird kind of disappear and just kind of sit up in the branch. So let's go ahead and so we talked about all these different strategies that we can attract wildlife, but also when thinking about dissuading wildlife, it's putting barriers, essentially, like these are the essentials. How can I create barriers for these species, for these problematic species, to keep them out? But we can definitely see that if we're creating this habitat, there's a lot of just natural control that's going to exist within it. And a lot of the times we'll have a lot of things that, like, when people call our office and say, I have a snake in my yard, I say, lucky, because they're doing a lot of control for you. They're being biological control, keeping maybe mice or rats at bay. So they actually are unbelievably beneficial. You should thank them for their free work. But we think about our attracting wildlife to landscape. I think about these two essential questions. So start from the beginning, right plant, right place. Think about the flora-friendly landscaping program and how we can use our landscapes as a place, not only to attract wildlife, but to become a space that helps reconnect these different fragmented landscapes. And by starting with right plant, right place, and just selecting plants that are going to be beneficial to wildlife, we have the ability to have an unbelievably diverse landscape. But then in order to help push that even further along, thinking about those essential elements, that food, the water, the shelter, it allows them to be happy, allows them to be fed and full, allows them to be hydrated and feel protected, but it also gives them a space to reproduce. And like Carl mentioned earlier, it's not just for the animals that stay around here, but you're creating an oasis for all the migratory animals that travel between habitats or are traveling halfway across the world to eat your white flies. So always just think, at the conclusion of our program, and we'll still have a couple minutes for questions. If you want to ask questions about specific wildlife, you can put that in the Q&A or the chat box, but always feel free to reach out to the Extension Office, the Master Gardener volunteers. We just love to be able to share all this information with everybody. If there's problems, anything that's horticulture related in your landscapes that you need help with, or to help achieve your goals, to plan your landscapes, use us as your resource. I always like to tell people we don't have skin in the game. Our goal is to just share knowledge and have fun doing it. We're just a bunch of plant nerds. Like, I love Shirley's mug. It says the plant lady on it, I think. Is that what it says on your mug? So we love, yes, there you go. We love sharing this knowledge and sharing this information with everybody in the community. So always feel free to reach out to us. That's what we're here for, to help serve you all. So that's it for our presentation. I'm going to send you all these resources, and I am going to also send you a copy of the presentation itself. And one thing that I do want to do if I can find it. Oh no, it closed on me. As part of all of our programs that we do in extension, we're always trying to evaluate our program.
We lost you, Taylor.
Yeah, we lost you.
Taylor's frozen. There he is.
There he is. You're muted.
I'm sorry, I'm back. That, you know, good thing to have it at the end of the presentation. So our internet just all went down. So I'll send that follow-up survey to everybody. So let's go ahead. So rather than having me fumble around and potentially get kicked off again, anybody have any questions that they would like to ask or anything like that? Because, you know, I think there's so many different things about wildlife that we can talk about, but within our little window that we have just to do this introduction, you know, I think it's, you know, just covering the basics is important, but I think it's important that we'll think about, you know, what are some other future programs that we can do for wildlife that's specific wildlife, whether it be you want to do butterfly gardens or if you want to landscape for birds, we can always target those specific topics. So feel free to ask any questions that you do have, and I can go ahead and stop the recording as well.